Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. Thought I would sit down and do a video for you guys and gals. All right, let's talk a little bit about the whole training volume thing. This is the thing that I've said this a lot lately, and I want to be very clear on this. The studies do show one thing consistently when it comes to training volume. And I'm going to state in a minute that exercise science studies are not the best studies in the world. They're difficult to utilize and find trends in because it's not particularly well done science, and it's not the fault of the researchers. It's the fact that there's simply not enough interest to get funding to do the studies that we would need to do. Okay, so that is something to consider, but I want people to also think about the fact that the studies that do show really high volumes causing more muscle growth, it is a microscopic amount. Okay, in other words, it is not what is going to cause your gains. It's not what's going to make or break you. The whole idea being studied there is looking at the finishing touch. Can you gain an extra 1% or 3% more muscle growth for the year if you train twice as much? That's what they're looking at. So I want us to be clear here. It's not saying, hey, people on high volume training are going to gain muscle and people on more moderate volume won't gain any. That has never, ever, ever been found in any study, to my knowledge. No even decently done study. But the problem we do have to keep in mind of why we have to be careful with these trends is because exercise science, as I've said many times, doesn't have the funding for muscle growth studies to really do well done studies. They use almost exclusively untrained lifters, okay? Which for any of us chiming in, we don't care about. We already know how to make novice lifters big. There are countless free programs that have proven it. I mean, I put out a free program in 2012 that's even on this channel still. They got published that thousands and thousands of people ran and they all got gains. Thousands of people got gains on it. Novice program, it's free. We don't need more data to show how to make new gains faster. They're already super fast with the knowledge we have. So we're not getting many studies on more trained lifters. And when we do, they almost never really show high volume having a benefit. Keep that in mind. But we don't get enough studies on it. So we don't have the proper test subjects. Number two, they're too short in duration because it's kind of hard to get people to stick through for a full year and to get funding for a full year, right? That's a problem. Number three, too small of sample sizes. This is why we see so much inconsistency. This is one reason I think, one of the reasons we see that every school of thought, like you see different researchers getting different results in these areas that conflict with each other, because we're not testing enough people. A study of 20 people for 10 weeks is simply not enough for us to really get through just the fuzz in the data. Okay, it is simply not a large enough sample size. We need 500 people. We need 1,000 people done for a year. And if we don't have that, we do have to be careful on how strong of conclusions we draw from this data. And I'm not saying we can't draw conclusions. I'm saying just be careful with realizing the flaws in the data gathering that exists. Again, this is through no fault of the researchers. So a lot of them, I mean, I have some who might chime in who are working in that area. They're like, well, it's not our fault. And I agree. No one's blaming you. No one's saying, hey, you, Mr. Researcher, why aren't you doing a study with 1,000 people for a year straight? 1,000 trained lifters. And they're like, because I don't have $10 million. Exactly. Not your fault. So, therein lay the problem. But here's the thing to think about when you do look at the studies. All the studies that look at volume, how many studies out there have found 5 or 6 sets, hard sets per week, produce robust muscle growth? Lots of them. Lots of them. We've got studies even going back 10, 20 years showing 5 or 6 sets to failure, 8 sets to failure. What happened? The test subjects all gained significant amounts of muscle mass. Always. Even studies on glutes and squats, 6 sets of squats to failure per week produced massive growth in women's glutes who were trained lifters. Massive amounts, very measurable amounts, even in 10 weeks. Okay? We've got a lot of studies showing those sort of training volumes absolutely work. Same thing, 10 sets, they work very, very well, consistently in studies. What we find though is the really high volume is where you see the inconsistency. Okay? There have been a few studies done that showed higher volumes going beyond that caused less muscle growth. And I don't mean not less per set. I mean literally a couple studies looking at 15 or 20 sets a week found that the people literally gained less muscle than the people who did 10 hard sets. Why? Because they probably weren't recovering session to session. It was interfering with the next training session, getting an overall reduced quality of stimulus, and they simply gained less muscle. All right, so we've got that school of thought. We've got other studies that have shown no real benefits to doing higher volumes. And then we've had studies showing 20, 30, 50 sets a week caused more muscle growth than 10. However, I want to be clear on that. And this is the point people miss. It was not large amounts of extra muscle growth. Okay, in other words, studies that have found doing 30 sets caused more muscle growth than 10 sets. It wasn't like double the gains. It was they gained a little bit more. Okay, it's not like they gained an extra pound of muscle here, guys. Okay, it was grams of muscle over the other groups. So when we look at it in that context, we have to remember that. So when the evidence-based circles are pushing this, you've got to keep in mind they're pushing studies showing that some of these studies are showing a larger training response and larger hypertrophy, but some of those studies, the data measuring has been called into question, as in maybe even the measurements were not that well done. Some people have called some of them out for, again, even some of it, they're not waiting for the inflammation to go down from training. It could be water weight, not true tissue, all sorts of stuff, problems with no double blinding. But the ones that have done the stuff correctly and have done that, because there have been a couple that have kind of gotten around that and they have waited for inflammation to go down. They're trying to double blind studies things. What they found is that extra muscle growth versus the much lower volumes, it was a little bit, it was like 5% or something. Maybe I think in some cases up to 10% more muscle growth. So what that means is instead of gaining 10 pounds of muscle over X number of months or years, if those studies were extrapolated out, you would gain like 10 and a half. Okay? It's not a night and day difference. It's not enough of a difference that you are going to notice it in a period of time. So when they're pointing this out, we are talking about trying to optimize every single last drop of growth you can in theory get, at least in the short term, because keep in mind, overuse injuries accumulate. All these things are a problem potentially. Burnout from it. So it's trying to squeeze every last bit you can get, assuming everything else is perfect. So in other words, if you're not already gaining muscle at a solid pace, adding that extra 10 or 15 sets a week isn't going to make you start gaining muscle if you weren't gaining muscle with the programming you were doing already. It's pretty unlikely. So keep that in mind. They're simply trying to optimize for people who are already making solid gains. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys and gals next time.